you're not already. Okay, so this morning, who here remembers anything about the story we just heard about Moses? Yeah? Emmaus? Okay. Yeah? Archer, that was a great kind of synopsis, summary. Thank you. Yes. Right? Yeah? Yes. He had to take off his shoes. Right. Okay, what's the deal with why did he say that he needed to take off his shoes? Okay, anyone other than Archa or Aoife would be great. But if not, did you guys, why did he take off his shoes? Can y'all remember? All right, Archer. And what were you going to say, Aoife? He was on holy ground. Okay, so I want to hear from you guys. What is holy ground? When you think about holy ground, what do you think of? Yes, Penelope. Ground with holes in it? That is very smart, Penelope. Holy ground, I get it. Aoife? Where people pray and worship God. That's what you think of. Archer? The church tiles. That is a really great, very literal answer to exactly what we're talking about. Both of you guys had great answers because Aoife, where do we go to worship to God and pray often? The church or a mountain. In this case, we're talking about a mountain. But where do we go? I know you guys know this. Where do we go on a regular basis to do those things? We go to church. That's right. We go to church. So that's a place that we go. And why do you think that God said to take off his shoes? Yeah, Archer. Yes, you're walking on holy ground, but it's because this is a very specific place where we are called to be close to God, okay? So you're supposed to remove your shoes because this is the place not only where you're supposed to be respectful, but what are we watching out for when we come into the church? What are we getting that much closer to when we come to church? Yeah. God and Jesus, that's right. When we come to church, this is a place where we are most likely going to experience, or we hope that we are going to experience God and Jesus that much closer, okay? So, on the count of 3, I want you to name the Son of God who we're going to be that much closer to when we come into the church, or we hope, okay? I already see some people making the look that they're going to be saying. Okay, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Jesus! All right, good job, guys. All right, I did not see that holy ground thing coming, but I loved it so much. So that was the best answer, maybe. Okay, so from going to holy ground, I want to go to professional wrestling. So I know that might be a little bit unexpected, but I'm sure we have some professional wrestling fans out there, but you don't have to own up to it. It's okay if you're a little bit ashamed. And I know there are some of you, because I've talked to you about this, but I'm not going to call anyone out. But that's where we're going this morning. Now, before we go any further, I just want to make a disclaimer that I am not a big professional wrestling fan. But if you'd asked me 5 years ago if at any point in my life I would be talking about professional wrestling, much less in a homily, I would have thought you were delusional. But it turns out, as things do turn out, that my lovely husband is a huge professional wrestling fan. Yeah. And yes, I mean the professional wrestling with the ridiculous outfits and the fireworks and the predetermined wins. Yeah. And I hope I'm not ruining anyone's morning about that little bit. But my wonderful husband loves professional wrestling. And when I first found out about this, I was devastated. Because I was raised in a household in which events like that were considered utter foolishness. So when I showed up to my husband's house when we were first dating, and he opened the door for me wearing a professional wrestling championship belt, I knew we had to have a very serious conversation. Because I just had to know just how can this smart, sweet, funny, thoughtful man such as himself be such a huge fan of these really ridiculous, goofy events? But he said all the right things, of course. He simply explained the intrigue, the live play out of good and evil happening right before your eyes, the theatrical drama mixed with athleticism, and the evolution of theater and athletics, similar, this is his words, more or less, similar to that of what we crave when we watch superhero movies. And I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. And so we began to watch. Every Wednesday night, we would watch a particular wrestling show, and I slowly got to know the characters, and I got to understand the plot lines, and understood the appeal to a degree. And I don't support the real violent acts that involve blood and serious pain, but, for worse sake, I do find myself drawn to how the characters evolve and they grow and how the relationships change. And of course, the outfits. Have you seen the fringe on some of these outfits? It's so amazing. Now, all of that being said, I've learned a bit about professional wrestling as I watch it with my husband, who, by the way, in case you're interested, used to have a podcast about professional wrestling and faith with other two priests, which is really weird, but, you know, we never really got into that stuff. So, Worth told me about what the heel was, and as you can imagine, the heel in a storyline is the bad guy. And I learned what a baby face was, and of course, that's the good guy. And a lot of other language used that is really pertinent to the world of wrestling. Of course, I began to have my own favorites, and those I just could not stand, the ones I really loved to hate. And that, actually, is how we get to our text to today, the antagonists of the story. And really, depending on the perspective of the viewer of these stories, we can even call them underdogs, the jerks who are good for nothing. And like I mentioned, that is what brings me to all of our biblical texts that we read for today. Because first, we have Moses, called by God to lead God's people out of bondage to Egypt. He kind of seems like a hero. And we would absolutely believe that, but what we didn't read from last week and this week is totally skipped, thanks New Revised Lectionary. We were skipped crucial lines that what happened to Moses when he grew up. Immediately after being that sweet baby that was found in the river, he grew up, and he had just murdered this Egyptian that he saw beating on a Hebrew. Now, granted, it is somewhat of a gray area, We don't know the specific details of what would have been a very detailed police report, but what we do know is that he was a murderer. He killed someone and was running from the Egyptians, and he found shelter and was trying to live a quiet life on the down low. And who does God call upon to lead the freeing of God's people from bondage? No one other than this guy, an absolute underdog. So overall, the story of Moses is 100% an underdog story. Now, fast forward to the gospel. If you look at it from Peter's perspective, he believes that Jesus is the underdog, the one with all the odds stacked against him. Because after all, that is how we describe an underdog, the unlikely hero, or the one expected to lose. And from Peter's perspective, that makes total sense. Peter has witnessed Jesus interrogated and condemned by respected religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes. He's heard Jesus say some really outlandish things during his Sermon on the Mount. If you are Peter, you have definitely seen Jesus put it all out there. But here's the thing. What if we think about humanity from God's perspective? Who is the underdog from God's perspective? It is a little disheartening to think about in moments. But if we consider the greatest stories, the story of God and humanity over the period of history, the only rational conclusion we can come to is the one in which humanity is the underdog. And it is God that has been consistently cheering us on. I often feel like I know God's intention for me. Sometimes it seems so clear, but then I remember my own short history and all the mistakes I've made. The ones who are afraid, that's us. Who is lacking faith? Not Jesus. We are the ones lacking faith. We are the ones that desire more than we possibly could know what to do with. We want it all. We constantly don't understand the ways of God, those ways that desire all humanity, all creation to live free, to have enough, to live joyfully without fear, loving God and our neighbor. And this is why Jesus reacts so strongly to Peter, because Peter thinks he understands humanity, and he thinks he understands what discipleship looks like in the world. He thinks there will be no need of suffering. Now, Peter gives himself away at this moment. He doesn't understand that the world he lives in is still utterly against his Lord, and continues to be, even today. That is why Peter and the rest of us are underdogs. We are underdogs because we still craved the pressures of this world. We refuse to acknowledge the powers and principalities, the reality of sin in our own lives and in the world around us as terrible power. And with it comes suffering. Today, the suffering will not be our lives on a cross. It comes in a very different form. One of the most magnificent storylines, back to wrestling, that I've followed in professional wrestling is one of a heel called MJF, or better known as Maxwell Jacob Friedman. He's a young man. He is currently the holder of the championship belt. And he has told the viewers who are watching on many times of his distrust of anyone. He's talked of his own pains, his own suffering, how he was bullied. And it is in all of this pain that he is perhaps one of the greatest heels of all time. He's a cheater. He bullies. He tricks people for his own gain. He's the person who hurts others when their back is turned. He's pretty much the epitome of despicable. Now, That is, until the last few months. Somehow, some way, he got thrown into a tag team match randomly with one of the friendliest, most likable wrestlers on the program, a wrestler named Adam Cole. So then we're all left wondering, what? How could this be? What's going to happen? And slowly, over the past few months, since they know they're going to be tag team buddies, if you will, we begin to see a whole different side to MJF. The program showed a progressing friendship between the two. We saw snippets of MJF being vulnerable with Adam Cole and admitting to a real friendship. Oh, but hold on. Too many times have we, or I, been suckered into believing that MJF, this underdog, has changed his ways. This past weekend, their friendship was put to the test. Not only had they won their big old tag team match, but now, at the very end, in the main event, they faced each other for the championship title belt, one which MJF has held for many months and has done unspeakable, if you will, things to get it. At the end of the match, MJF wins, and we see Adam Cole, our friendly wrestler, the one with all the honor and all the goodness, waver about the outcome of the match. After all, he really wanted to win too. And that is when we hear MJF, who realizes that Adam Cole is upset by the outcome of the match. Is that all our friendship was about to you? This title belt? It really didn't matter. Nothing really mattered about our friendship. Fine, take the belt. And MJF turns his back on Adam Cole and throws down his title belt, expecting Adam Cole to pick it up and hit him over the back of the head. Adam Cole, after a slight hesitation, throws it back to the ground. And MJF turns around to see Adam Cole standing, arms open. They embrace, friends through the battle of it all. And here is how we got here, though, to this gut-wrenching moment, to where fans throughout this 80,000 plus arena are screaming for MJF. We got here through suffering. No, not wrestling suffering, okay, or haphazard suffering, but we got here through a suffering of willing vulnerability, to be open for the sake of relationship, to experience love. That is what God calls us into. God calls us into this kind of suffering. It is at the heart of discipleship, at the heart of our own refinement. Now, don't hear me saying that suffering of all kinds or any kinds is good. A survivor of domestic violence is not closer to God simply because of their suffering. This is a suffering solely for the sake of the gospel. And it starts with a deep-founded understanding, a deep-rooted spiritual life, like the one Father Donovan talked about last week. It starts with a grounded spiritual practice, an inner spiritual life that roots you in the foundation of Christ that you need to suffer for his gospel, to push back against the powers of sin in the world that are pushing against you in your daily life. Suffering is putting ourselves in a position to respond inwardly or outwardly to God's gift of abundant love. This kind of suffering is a consequence of our grand love for God and others. May we find intention deeply rooted in the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, celebrating the little wins we find as the underdogs in our own stories.